permaculture, or at least, many people agree that permaculture would mean that we are really good stewards of the capital that we have.
Mhm.
But it's not just because we're like tree hugging do-gooders, like we just want to like, take care of the earth. We have to understand it as like we're in a symbiotic relationship with the species that we want to continue. Like ultimately, the earth doesn't care if it's, filling land with a bunch of poison stuff or it's filling land with a bunch of potatoes. Like the ground itself doesn't care, but we care. We need to eat the potatoes versus the poison stuff.
Right.
So permaculture is saying, hey, you have these resources that are also called capital, and you want to take care of this capital because you want to basically continue your survival the way you want to do it.
I'm Deacon Rada. I'm a permaculture instructor focusing on social permaculture, and within that, focusing on economics. And I'm joined by Wesley.
Yeah, I'm Wesley Little, and I am a therapist, and I'm going to be learning from Deacon what these concepts mean.
One caveat I would make is that, so I was talking about there are 8 forms of capital.
Right.
There are also 3 layers of resource.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So capital is any resource that you can draw from continually, right? So you have a house, your house is capital, right?
Yeah, but this is where I feel like that can be confusing, because when I was reading this stuff, I was like, draw from continually makes it seem like it's like a never ending source of capital.
Sometimes.
But yeah, but lots of things are going to have an end to it.
Right, sure. But it's the draw doesn't bring it to an end. Not directly.
Oh.
Yeah.
So time could bring it to an end.
Yeah, everything ends. But
yes.
Like if you compare the thing I often use because house is such a good go-to is a bucket of paint. Like,
yeah,
that's a commodity.
Right.
Right. If you paint your house, the bucket of paint is gone.
Right.
You sunk the commodity into your capital.
Yes.
Right. And so it's really important to distinguish, I think, when we're really talking about stewarding resources, like it actually gets really, it's very utilitarian to like distinguish between capital, commodity, and currency, because you can't be a good steward unless you have that distinction.
Okay.
If that makes sense. And you have all 3 things in all 8 forms of capital. In some forms, it's like a little bit more like, in some forms, it's more relevant than others. But you're always going to have currency, which actually is also not exhausted, but it leaves, it transfers, right? So if you have a dollar bill, you think like the dollar bill you used to buy the bucket of paint,
mm-hmm.
the person who you get the paint from, they get the same value of dollar. The dollar is the same to them that it was to you, but you don't have it anymore. So that's how it's not capital. The paint, you use it and then it's just gone. So nobody has it, commodity. The house is increased or like, sustained, but you can, and like it actually, the paint will eventually wear off. Like it, like things can happen to it. So it's not like that it's just eternal, but it's perennial, right? Perennial is probably the better word than like infinite, especially because we're talking about permaculture here. So like your apple tree is a perennial, that's capital. The apple is a commodity, right? The water going into the apple tree, that's a currency in the system. Same as the wind. The wind, apple trees can't survive without wind. So like you have multiple currencies, or almost no trees can survive without wind. But you have multiple currencies that are necessary to maintain your capital. And most capital needs some maintenance. And then you get commodities out of the capital.
Okay, I think I understand. So I think you're doing such a good job explaining that. I understand, I think, the difference between commodity, currency, and capital. And those are all really good analogies. But I think I'm still wondering, like, is permaculture basically like the study of how to create a sustainable symbiotic system? Like, is it the study of it? Help me understand with like the bigger picture.
So yes and no. It is, so like in maths, there's a division between pure maths and applied maths. I don't know if you
No,
know any
Deacon, I
mathematicians.
have no idea what
Okay.
that is.
Cool. I might just well, I'm going to stick with it for a minute because you understand like what maths is, and everybody watching.
I
can know.
understand the difference between theoretical and applied.
Okay, sure. Well, the schools and universities, they hate each other. We're like, from all the mathematicians I've ever known personally, like that's the story I get told. I'm not myself a mathematician. I just, sometimes hang out with them. But in permaculture, there's a similar thing, actually. It's less hateful because we're not mathematicians. And so as people, we're less hateful. Frequently I find a lot of mathematicians are very spiteful, angry people.
Okay, we're going to have to put a parentheses. Probably not you, mathematician.
Probably not you.
You're probably wonderful.
But mathematicians will understand when I say, like, I've known a very small sample size of mathematicians, right? So my opinion is worthless in that regard. But this schism or whatever, it exists. In permaculture, there are people like myself. I'm a theorist, right? Like, I have worked on sites, right? I've run an organization that managed physical sites. And then I shifted into social permaculture, and I've worked on and still work on like social permaculture projects, which count as sites, right? So I still do that. I am an applied permaculturist, but in a lot of my work, I work very theoretically, and I work with the social permaculture metapod, which is a collective. It's like a mastermind of permaculture theorists, right? And so some of the things like I'm talking about, like the importance of distinguishing between the three types of resources, because like my specialty within the permaculture mastermind is economics. And so I really emphasize like those economic aspects. You might talk to another permaculturist, even like a serious theorist who's published books, like who would be like, oh no, that's like, I've kind of heard that. I've heard Deacon talk about it, but like, it's not super important to permaculture. And that's fine. So there is this theoretical wing of like people that just get really heady about it. To most permaculturists, it is a practice. So you think about like people in the future, right? That most of them are working designers. They are never going to try to expand color theory ever. Like they're going to learn, they're going to take Greg Gunn's course. They're going to learn that much color theory, and they're going to go out and try to get clients, and God bless them, right? Because that's the work that needs to get done to make the world less ugly, right? And that's most permaculturists have, like, I would say probably the vast majority have, like, they own a house and they've got, a 1/4 acre house plot, mostly in the UK or Australia, or they're working in a collective in Costa Rica or Guatemala or Oaxaca. Like those are places where it just happens to be popular, right? And they're with that collective or in their family, they're trying to get the most out of the space that they have. And they're not trying to look into the fringes of the theory. They're mostly, the whole body of permaculturists are practitioners who are trying to apply the theory to get the most out of what they have.
Yeah. And do you feel like this is most in terms of creating food? Or do you feel like this is also like, it could be totally unfood and land related, or would it always have an agriculture component to it?
It doesn't always have an agricultural component, and the agricultural component isn't always food. So like, for instance, there's one woman I actually started following not super long ago on Instagram who's a permaculturist, and she has an amazing farm, and she mostly grows textile products. Like she has a loom, she has several looms, and like spinning, like she has beautiful pictures of spindles and her weaving and the growing process and refining flax, and she's got goats, and it's the same. I'm sure she grows food there too. It's just not her focus, and so it's not what she highlights. Or I would assume she grows food also because she's an accomplished gardener. Why wouldn't you grow your own spices at least?
Sure. She probably has an awesome rhubarb patch and some raspberries.
So yeah, people can have different emphases. I don't know. But land-based permaculture, which is the majority of permaculture, is mostly focused on growing food and creating really living systems. And so a lot of these spaces, you have like intentional communities are a big one, where you got like a bunch of hippies or like people who are too lonely to be preppers, so they're a little bit extroverted, so they want to hang out with friends. And so they get some land together, and that's what they're doing. And so it's not necessarily commercial agriculture. Permaculture is not super great for commercial agriculture in most senses, because you can't compete with big mega farms for like crop yield. what you can do is you can partner with a restaurant or own a restaurant. And I know a few people who do this in the permaculture scene, who you get that piece of farmland, and your collective that bought that farmland also owns a restaurant in the city, and you do straight farm to table. And then you have absolute control over quality and your variety and what's going to be on the menu. You can forecast, seasonal menu stuff really, really nicely. And you can develop a super high-end restaurant that has a great offering. And then you have a commercially competitive entity. And permaculture is great for that. But yeah, those are the main applications that I see in terms of like majority.
And if we go back to the idea of it, maybe I'm going to say this wrong, but like if the goal is that it's self-sustaining somehow, or the goal is that you don't need to bring in outside stuff other than the air and water currencies, is that a main thing in permaculture that you're like, we want it to be almost, I don't know, like you can just go hands off of it at some point?
That's a design paradigm, like a kind of a principle of the design. At the center of permaculture, you have this like trifecta of ethos that are kind of vague and get interpreted a little bit differently. Well, depending on who you ask. Well, I guess that's kind of what it means to be vague. But the ethics are people care, earth care, and fair share, right?
Okay.
And
wait, so let's say that slower, because I think people would like that. People care.
People care for the people. Earth care. And then fair share, which sometimes gets stated a little bit differently. Obviously, I have a lot to say about the fair share part, being an economics-focused permaculture theorist. And different people have different things to say about the other parts, and it's very open to interpretation. What does it mean to care for the people? What does it mean to care for the earth? But what I would say all permaculturists do agree on is that that's the point. Those three things are the point.
Okay.
Creating a farm that runs itself, like a Pee Wee Herman alarm system or whatever, that's just the Rube Goldberg device of efficiency. That's not the point. Like, it's cool. And some people kind of go that route with their like water catchment and like super like effective like gray water, black water systems and irrigation. Like you can get really teched out actually with permaculture designs, but that's not the point.
Okay.
That's just craft. It's technique. Like the point is to take care of people well, to take care of the earth, to be a good steward of natural resources, and to also, because we're starting at a deficit, it's not just to take care of what you have, it's to restore the things that are broken, because we're racing against the clock in terms of just surviving. And so that's, I think, mostly agreed upon by the whole social permaculture scene, or permaculture scene, as implicit within care for the earth, is that it has to be regenerative, because we can't just stand still anymore.
Yeah.
And then fair share methodologically means a lot of different things to different people. But the thing that I think all the different views have in common is that, like, one cannot overly tax a system. Like you can't move. So we have these 8 forms of capital. If any one of them is growing at the cost of the others, you messed up. Your design's bad. Like, so I think that all the different perspectives on what fair share means would agree with that. That you can't grow one form of capital at the expense of the others. And obviously the most classic of that is growing your financial capital at the expense of natural capital and cultural capital, et cetera.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. And maybe we'll do a future video, like really getting nitty gritty into the different types of capital, which I know you've also been talking about on Instagram, and I'm sure in other places. So, okay, something I'm curious about as I'm hearing this, because like as I hear you describe it, I'm like, wow, like this makes sense. Like this seems like a really beautiful theory, a theory that has a lot of, both intellect and heart in it. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised that I've never heard about this. And so I'm curious, like, is that just me? Like, have I just been out of the loop somehow because of like the work that I do? And like, is this more talked about than I realize? Or is this more niched into like little pockets of?
It's not you. You got to think about like what permaculturists do from like everything we just talked about. It's like we make paradises and we have everything we need in them. So like,
So are you saying I haven't heard about it because they're all so happy they're living in their paradise?
Like actually kind of, yeah. Like
Okay.
that's sort of how it works. Is like,
Okay.
like there's a woman I've been collaborating with a little bit who is a instructor at a permaculture school in Costa Rica. Her name is Elizabeth Coos. And I think if anybody's watching this, I think you can find her on Instagram just at Elizabeth Coos, like spelled, and I might be pronouncing her last name wrong because we've just been, typing. So it's Couse. And if you look at her life, and I genuinely believe that it's like this because it goes back, years and years. Like it is posh. It's just like, this is the waterfall that I bathe in every day. These are the people I hang out with. They're all like gorgeous and super fit because this is the food we eat. And it's like, it's just like, oh man, like that's what permaculture does. If you stick to it and you're diligent, you just end up with a paradise and nobody leaves.